Hello, students. Welcome to our lecture on Mughal painting. Unlike our lecture on Mughal gardens, where the frame of Islamic belief in a paradise afterlife as conceived of as a very particular kind of garden with a total of 4 rivers running from a center that was closed, and the Mughal garden form reflecting that text description. When we turn to Mughal painting, the relation to Islam, of course, is quite important in many paintings, but our focus in this lecture will be more on the way in which the painting style, if you will, or visual language is shaped by the encounters of different visual traditions coming together in the multicultural courts of the Mughal emperors, and in particular, Akbar, the grandson of Babar. And Persian court painters, Indian painters who have developed a long visual tradition are in this court, and eventually also there is circulation of European painting traditions through reproductions and through trade that begins to happen with the opening of the Atlantic trade winds and more trade and exchange occurring. And your readings entitles this whole period as India opens out into the world. There's more openings, one can say, and then there's more opportunity for cultural fusion, cross-fertilization, and we see this all the time in the history of art, of course. Now we see it in the Mughal Empire. Let us turn to my slides so we can see some images, so what I'm saying gets a bit clearer. Oops, wrong slide. Forgive me while I zip through. There we are. The figure that is very important in our lecture today is Akbar. Akbar is the grandson of Babur, who founded the Mughal Empire. And Akbar was a man who loved the arts, he loved culture, he patronized them with great energy and conviction in their importance and in their quality. So he brought together the best artists in India that he could attract, and also had at his disposal Persian painters who had been brought first by his father, Humayun, whose name you'll see on the slide right here, who were Persian master artists in a Persian tradition. So we have 2 local Indian painting, or very well-established Indian visual forms of painting, not sculpture, painting on manuscripts, and Persian. And then we have a 3rd element, which is European traditions of painting that begin to come into India in the early 17th century with the opening up of the Atlantic trade winds and trade and exchange. And in the case of Akbar, he showed, many of these traders who are coming from Europe had kind of established themselves like on the coast. And Akbar was very welcoming and said, no, come in, let me know, who are you? I'm very curious. I want to know where you're from. What kind of objects do you have? What do you paint? What kind of music do you play? He was a humanist. He had a tremendous interest in others and in people and in culture. So at his courts, he cultivated a very vital exchange of visual ideas. And this wasn't only because of his inherent passion and aesthetics, although I think that was very important, and one will never know quite where in relation to a practical strategy, which is, as he expanded the Mughal Empire, you can see he expanded it significantly eastward, southeast, where along this region we had very vital painting traditions, Rajaput and Gujarat painting. And this class, we're not going to go into defining what I meant by saying that, except suffice it to say that there were well-established, well-respected, and important schools of Indian painting in the regions he conquered. And furthermore, the numbers of the number of Hindu people, believers, far outnumbered Islamic. So to cultivate a visual language that was familiar would be very important. And not only that, and I won't talk about this much in our lecture, he was interested in translating Hindu texts so that his own into Persian. So early on in our class, we saw like the Mahabharata that had Persian text on it. And that was a way of, I think, his curiosity, but also a way of affirming Hinduism. And so he was a great kind of an enlightened figure cultivating a multicultural empire, to put it in modern terms. The visual tradition that we're going to focus on is with regards to kind of a classical Indian style is exemplified here by the Kalpa Sutra, which is an image of Mahavira. It's coming out of the Jain tradition a little bit later than the manuscripts you looked at a few weeks ago, but probably also in the format with the figure being smaller, taking up less space than text. This should be a familiar form to you. So we have the relationship between word and image here is the word is quite prominent and dominates the field, the surface of this leaf. And the style, if you will, or the treatment of the body and coloring of the figures themselves is relatively flat. The color is very evenly dispersed across the sharply outlined bodies. You see these yellow bodies. There's not a lot of shading, not a lot of variation of that beautiful kind of like glowing, warm yellow, approaching kind of a slight mustardy tone. And then behind is this wonderful carnelian color that is probably coming from a particular kind of beetle in India, if I recall correctly. And these two they're analogous on the color wheel, but they really work beautifully together and they become quite recognizable if you look at a lot of these kinds of paintings at this time period. And it is what the court of Akbar would have seen being produced by artists that were considered the best of these traditions who were invited to his court. So this is one, let's say, stylistic voice in what will become a multi-pitched piece. Now, here is a magnificent example of Persian painting. It's an opaque watercolor gold and silver on paper. And it's, let me see if I worked on getting a hyperlink to work. I think it just worked. I certainly hope so. I probably have to turn off my slide share, so bear with me. I don't know what you see. So let me just stop that. Yes. Okay. So this is a Persian painting. I'm just going to zoom in just so you can see. This is based on a poem, kind of a revelatory poem about finding kind of spiritual awakening through allegories told through birds. And I'm contemplating whether I will make that a discussion assignment for you to look at this and relate it to a poem, a really light one. I haven't decided this week with your workload, but it's such a beautiful work anyway, in my view. But you can see here as we go in closely, this is a lot of interest in analogous pigments flowing into one another in an almost like reminds me of almost like the way an abalone shell or the iridescence of a pearl kind of quality. So it has this purples into warm maroons and then delicate yellows. It has this jewel-like quality, but it's a gentle, just almost pearl or abalone quality. And then a very high level of exquisite detail here. Lots of naturalistic attention to fine, exquisite flora and fauna. And yet it is fairly flat. If you were to imagine a glass was laying on top of this, and on the other side was not painting at all, but a real world. And you imagine how near would what you see in that world be to you, the beholder. It would almost be like it was lifting up to kind of rise up, kind of, and stand up and meet you in a way that spatially doesn't make sense if you think of this in a Western kind of conception of a window that's following plausibly realistic laws of our experience with depth and perspective. So notice the many curving lines. There isn't the Persian artist is not interested in patterns. There's not like repetitive patterns, but there is kind of a distinct linear style that's moving, kind of these beautiful soft curving rhythms that characterize almost every aspect of this work, except for the wildlife itself and the foliage, which are depicted with a high level of attention to accurate depiction of specific species of birds. The parrot, we have ducks, we have, I think, maybe a crane and an eagle. I'm not, my ornithology skills are not so good, but at any rate, and a peacock, obviously. So that is very different. There's not that same kind of like rhythmic treatment of line when the artist works on the naturalistic forms of these birds and other foliage. And then we have a very gold ground that has no depth at all, very decorative. So this is just, there's not a much more we can say, except when you're studying art as an art student or studying art history, a lot has to do with just looking and kind of getting a feeling for a style to kind of recognize when it's leaving its familiar form and being transformed, or when it's being taken into by another artist and being partially utilized. So that's what we just did together. Let's go back to the PowerPoint now. You cannot zoom in the same way. So what I want to do now is just show you three paintings together. First is the kind of classical Indian from the 15th century, Persian from of an aesthetic that's coming from Persia, via the Mughal love of Persian culture. And then a painting here that's commissioned by Akbar, where what we find is a kind of mixture in a way of these two styles by the artist. We have the bright colors, the more saturated orangey reds and yellows of this Mahavira, and here in the figure of Akbar, sitting in a similar way, colored in a similar way, and this warm kind of use of the backgrounds of this warm red, and sharper kind of angular forms relative to these soft curving forms, and a much greater delineation of color in general. So kind of higher contrast, essentially, a little bit more kind of a vibration of different colors against each other, rather than a kind of soft kind of gradations of families of colors that work together to create a more muted color effect. And the point then is that the artistic output in Akbar's court was one that was one that welcomed really free and creative painting, and artists were able to just simply work and draw from multiple traditions, primarily this Indian, local Indian and Persian. Now, what is the picture that we're looking at? Let me see here if I can just itself. What we're looking at here is Akbar, and I've actually given you the reference because it is important. Akbar the Great holds a religious assembly in the Ibadat Khana. And Ibadat Khana was a hall of prayer that Akbar had conceived of, that welcomed all faiths and faith, belief, religion, and welcomed discussion. And what we find is here in the left, let's see if I can give you a little detail. Two Jesuit missionaries here. You can see in their European clothing, their features. And they are in an environment which appears to be Islamic and probably Hindu. So not only does the painting reflect a kind of really comfortable freedom to draw on multiple painterly traditions from very different cultures, but its subject exemplifies the idea that the sum is greater than the parts, and to draw together different aesthetic traditions is a fruitful and worthwhile endeavor and produces new and exciting works of art that themselves express the kind of mingling of multiple cultures. So this is a very important aspect of Akbar. So in my notes here, he invited scholars belonging to various religions, Hinduism, Islam, Zoroastrianism, which is an older religion in Persia that was dominant before the Islamic conquest of Persia, Christianity, and even atheists. He conducted religious debates with these people. They visited the Ibat Khana and discussed their and welcomed a discussion. And this led them to the conclusion at the Hall of Prayer that all religions share the same goal. So ecumenical, essentially. Now, from a stylistic perspective, I just wanted to show you, here is a Persian painting on the right, Humayun receiving a deputation, that is the son of Babur and the father of Akbar. And then we have the Book of Akbar here. And I think you can see the Persian painting is much more like a mosaic of jewels, and it glitters and it's densely packed. The figures are fairly small. There are more forms per square inch by far in the Persian than there is here in this book of Akbar, which is now clearly drawing on the more open fields of Indian painting, where a clean, unembellished backdrop or ground was fine to set figures upon, and a greater clarity of figures' bodies and forms in general are more clearly defined and larger. This is almost, if you think of it, not to sound like a stereotype, but it's a bit like a carpet. How a beautiful, if you think of like a Persian carpet, how this incredible like bringing together of so many different beautiful details to produce this completely unified whole. So the point is, we have kind of a birth of a new style, if you will, and a language through the openness of Akbar. By the time we get to Akbar's son, Jahangir, we see a very strong presence now of European painterly traditions crossing with those that we've so far discussed. So when this artist we're talking about here is known, named Biktir, and this is Jahangir preferring a Sufi shaikh to kings from a St. Petersburg album, 1650 to 1640. What we're looking at here is Jahangir is shown seated on an elevated stone-studded platform whose circular form mimics the disc above his head. The emperor is the biggest of the 5 human figures painted, and the disc with his halo is a visual manifestation of his title of honor, and it's the largest object in the painting. And may certainly have come from his exposure to halos in European painting of holy figures. And the more humbly dressed, white-bearded Sufi shaikh is a Sufi mystic. Well, Sufis are mystics. It's a branch of Islam that we're not talking about in this module, but it is a kind of more ecstatic kind of way of knowing God through various physical austerities, but also a search to kind of go into an ecstatic state to experience kind of a fusing with the divine. And so here there's a beautiful kind of exchange happening here with a small book. And this is definitely reminding us, directly or indirectly, that this image itself was not a large painting hanging on a wall, but was the size approximately of that book, and would have belonged in an album of many images, finely painted. So these are luxury objects. They're not meant for large numbers of beholders to see. They're meant to be experienced rather intimately, closely. To see something up close, you have to get close to it. It's almost like you can kiss it or be very near it. And the level of beautiful, exquisite detail kind of invites that experience even more. But there's more. And the other point here is that the connection between Jahangir and Sufism is partly through his father. When Akbar had no living heir, when he was at the tender age of 28, he was worried at that age, not having a child yet, he had consulted with a Sufi, an Islamic mystic named Shaikh Salim, who assured him a son would come soon after a child was born and ascended to the throne in 1605. And he gave himself the honorary title of Light of Faith and the name Jahangir, Caesar of the world, seizing the world. And it was Jahangir that became much more interested in portraiture and the images of himself here, rather than the narrative paintings that we had seen previously in a tradition of Indian and Persian painting. And this more isolated portrait type with the halo, of course, no doubt is coming from traditions of European portraiture and religious subjects like Christ, like the Blessed Virgin Mary, like saints, like kings. And if we look closely at this medallion, we can see gold radiate from the emperor's head against a background of a larger, darker gold disc. And a slim crescent moon hugs most of the disc's border, creating a harmonious fusion between the sun and the moon, thus day and night, and symbolizing the ruler's emperorship over the world, but also of divine truth. He's seated on an elevated stone-covered disc, which almost looks like, could be like open and shut, like a compact. If Jahangir wasn't sitting in the middle of it, there's kind of a relationship there, almost a perpendicular relationship. But if you look more closely, it's actually skip some, we'll jump forward a bit. It's actually an hourglass, and it's suggesting time. It's in, so, and there's an inscription here being written by clearly European inspired angels at its base that says, Allah is great, O Shah, may the span of your reign be 1,000 years. So this was the start of the second Islamic millennium, the year, according to time, Islamic time, would correspond to 1591, 92, or 1,000 by the time system that Jahangir and the Mughals adhered to, unlike the Gregorian calendar that we have inherited. So during the Mughals were deeply aware of the astrological solar and lunar events and cycles and omens, and the sand is already running through the hourglass in recognition that the second millennium had begun when Jahangir assumed the throne in 1605. But this is no barrier to his self-styling as the messianic ruler who introduces a new era. So he becomes emperor when time has already passed. So with the new millennium already begun. And the use of the hourglass form reflects the trade and the Mughals' love of objects coming from Europe. This is coming from Augsburg. It was Augsburg, a National Museum in Warsaw, of an hourglass. And so this work of art is really reflecting this new trade that's occurring. And we know that there was a great interest in such trade, and particularly in objects related to time. Here we have another detail of a painting of Jahangir entertaining a Shah Abbas, and a detail of a figure in that work holding a European automaton that is kind of like a moving, kind of wind up metal robotic sculpture, kind of a precursor to a robot, but without electricity. It's wound up and then it would move a little, and that's called an automaton. And this was fascinating to the Mughal courts. And so here we have kind of a work of art that's drawing together numerous different aesthetic traditions, but most striking of all, well, I don't know if it's most striking of all, is if we look closely here, we can see very different kinds of faces and characters. We have the mystic Sufi, and then here we have the artist Victor himself presenting an album. And then significantly, we have King James, who is a European, obviously, and with a very kind of 16th century cap. And no doubt this particular painting was based on a portrait that had been given to Jahangir by an English ambassador of King James that had been painted by an artist known as Ortiz. And so we can see the Mughal painter really looking at European traditions of detailing lace, of facial features, of shading, and of decorative detail. But at the same time, preserving quite a lot of their own, of its own history of Persian interest in decorative detail and flat background. So it's really a hybrid. And we can see here another example of European influence are these little angels that recall Baroque or 16th, 17th century angels in any number of European domed cathedrals, would have been known through works of art and engravings that were circulating in the Mughal Empire. So Jahangir really brought into the aesthetic of Mughal painting a very strong European influence. And when you combine that new kind of way of painting with the kind of perspective and the interest in decorative, like fine detail, and still these beautifully decorative grounds, you have a really interesting combination of the delicacy of a European oil painting and the delicacy of a Persian miniature, but the brilliance and color of an Indian painting from Rajasthan or Gujarat. So when this is the kind of exciting thing that can happen when you're studying very different cultures that have been in very little direct contact, or at least had felt the freedom to mix creative ideas, being brought together and a space being held for them by an ambitious, strategic, and genuinely curious Mughal emperor. In this case, also one that is very now much interested in aggrandizing himself as a kind of holy figure. One could argue he is above time itself. He's not subject to time because time occurs below him. He's in the realm of the eternal as he's taking a book from a Sufi. He has conquered time. And these little angels saying that may he live forever, pray be to Allah, in a sense reinforces that as well. In Mughal India at this time, in the early 17th century, we find an incredible interest in natural forms. We're looking here at vultures that are very painted with great delicacy and detail. These are pictorial studies of nature. And we can credit this again with the Mughal courts, and this particular artist is named Mansour. But notice that the kind of format of the folio with this beautiful kind of like binding and matting and with tremendous kind of a fabric, in a sense, brocade detail, it continues. Now, the last work we'll look at is by Shah Jahan, who is the son of Jahangir, and he really moves Mughal painting into a much more atmospheric painting that recalls visions of paradise, of a perfected and idealized world, very still. And so the naturalism and the interest in representing nature is suppressed a little bit to create this sense of an ideal, purified world. And you can definitely sense this in this wonderful equestrian portrait of Shah Jahan, who's framed with a much more reduced and delicate treatment of forms, where there seems to be an understanding that by taking away detail, by taking away effort, and sumptuous patterns, images of flowers, by moving and creating a kind of smooth backdrop, this kind of stillness and almost timelessness can take shape in the work of the artist, and to evoke now Shah Jahan, not a man of this world, but of a higher kind of reality. And this is further affirmed by this very prominent halo around his head. And at this time, Christian images of Christ and saints were well known in these courts. Here's a detail. Even these birds, these little delicate birds in the sky, their bodies are, it's almost like they're just drawn an outline, and their bodies are the color of the sky. So concerned to focus the attention now on this still figure of Shah Jahan. And Shah Jahan also was quite interested in other kinds of images. Here he appears dominating the world in a kind of work that's combining European and this new kind of idealizing aesthetic that you're reading in the module does a nice job talking about these forms. I'm going to close the lecture just by moving through some details very slowly. So this is a tiny painting and expression of power and beauty. So how something very small can be a powerful expression of beauty. And we see it's a lush world this emperor lives in. Beyond the horizon, we see his empire, and yet he's alone and dressed up and quite isolated in his extravagance, in suggesting he's not of this world, but he's of a world of great luxury and associated with a paradise. We've come to the north of India. We know this because, and it feels like summer, because there are flat bottom boats by the Yamuna River here. The white structure that recalls Mughal temples and mausoleums. In the upper right corner, some decidedly European angel forms holding jewels. We've find kind of a very, almost a mini refracted color spectrum here in his halo. And he is wearing the jewels that a groom would wear, Islamic groom would wear to his wedding. And the way his belt is tied tells us he's not Hindu, who tied in a different direction, but Islamic. And we can see the beautiful kind of decorative base here at 8 inches tall. So while this is an image of great beauty and great delicacy, it's also an image of great stillness, stability, and power. And that's what's so interesting about these Mughal portraits, is the way in which refinement, beauty, and otherworldly quality in no way take away a sense that he is a figure of great power and authority. And this is very different than the kind of mystical, devotional engagement we saw in Hindu art, in Hindu sculpture. Here we have a figure turned away, so there is no possibility of meeting this man's gaze, this Shah Jahan's gaze. We only stare at him, and he is in a remote plane of being, and yet in absolute control and authority, just as a Mughal empire would like to be. So enjoy the reading about Mughal painting in your module, and enjoy your week of studies. And as always, I'll give a slide list for any images that you need to know. And if it's not labeled in my lectures, it's not something you're going to need to know.